Good morning. Hemshech Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1229. What we learned yesterday was the difference between Katnus and Gadlus, less developed and more developed, in the stage, what he calls Murgash mitzad haseichel, which means that it's emotions that are driven primarily by the mind, but in that itself, there are levels. You could have the natural emotion that a human being has, the natural love, let's say a child has to a parent. So it's coming from their natural self, but the mind works as a guide that reminds you or makes you aware. And you could have what he calls a mature, an adult, what he said, a zaken, a saba, a mature, seasoned person who does not just follow his natural emotions. It comes up his seichel. Seichel is the primary force, if not the and that contemplation awakens an emotion. And that he calls Gadlus. And both these levels, as we're going to learn in a moment, is seichel as it relates to midas, to emotions. Okay, so I want to just sum it all up, because we've been talking about all these different levels. It can be a little confusing. So I want to sum it up in the following manner. If we go from the bottom up, where we talk about pure behavioral, mutfa, what do you call it? Pure natural behavioral, that doesn't have any feeling. It's just actions. It's reflexive behaviors. Like you see a child that just flails their arms and legs, or they suck on a bottle, or they do other things that are natural to them. So though that individual does have an emotional structure, but it's not yet become apparent. He called that nihi, mutva, ibur. In that level itself, the Rabbi Rashab went to the next step, where there is a recognition in the mind and in the heart of the value of the divine. I'm going over to the divine. I won't speak only biological. So it's not just behavioral sumerav aseitev, that the person just following the letter of the law exactly as God says he wants of us. There's also a sense and feeling in the mind and the heart. It's still called talumas libay, because it's not a full-blown emotion. It's the heart, the mind and the heart both appreciate the idea, appreciate that sense, and sense the importance, what he calls ye'asaloi, that it's fitting and it's appropriate and beautiful to be absorbed in the godliness. But he still calls that a heskim levad. It's still basically a determination, a commitment. But something has already begun to be born in the world begin to be revealed, I should say, in the world of emotions, but it's not yet an emotion. It seems that is still a level of mutfa, but you're starting to have the murgash and the mutfa, if you wish. Then comes the next level, where the emotions begin to be felt in a real way, because the mind. Let's just go back a moment, what the next level, what he calls. Let me just, 1 second, let me look at something. Yeah, so mutfa is only the action, the behavior. And then he says, and he also called Tmima Shebelev, if you remember, the Tmima Shebelev, the sincerity, what do we say? The sincerity, the purity, Okay. So this second level now is when the midas, the emotions, are beginning to take hold. I'm looking at the bottom of page 1226 now. So even there, there's still childish emotions, so to speak, but now the emotions are beginning to Gadlus hamidus. Right. And this is enhanced as the mind is also developing because it appreciates godliness. It appreciates God as our Father and God as our source of sustenance. That is the next step, Murgash. In Murgash itself, there's the Katnus we just spoke about, that we learned yesterday. Where you have some seichel that is guiding the emotion, but the primary thing is emotions, the natural emotion. And then comes Murgash mitzad seichel, where now seichel is the driving force of the emotions. There's still the human being's emotions, but now you're talking about a mature contemplation, like we spoke about, the contemplation, not just what God is for us, our Father and our sustenance, but God as the greatness of God within creation, within existence, and so on. And that is still Murgash mitzad seichel. We're now going to learn that that's still seichel that relates to midas, because the key thing there is that it's giving birth to an emotion. The only difference is it's not coming only from the natural emotions, it's coming also from the seichel that is awakening, that is giving birth to these emotions. But it's still about an emotional experience. We're now going to learn another higher level. Okay, so those are the stages. In the parentheses on top of the page, what he said was, based on the Tanya, that the first level, what I just said now, the contemplation, the Murgash, not mitzad seichel, the Murgash, that's a result of the natural feelings that come together with the recognition of the mind. He called that tivim, mutva. He said when it becomes revealed in your heart, that would be Murgash. And the Murgash mitzad seichel is still called tivim because at the end of the day, it still relates to emotions. I'm going to explain this more shortly because there's also the difference between contemplating on something that's natural to you and contemplating on something that's not part of who you are, which is also, as I said, somewhat of a distinction between those two dimensions. But I'll elaborate on that after we learn the next section. So that's what we have so far. The kol zeh, I'm continuing now. The line begins teva on page 1229, more than 2/3, 4/5 of the way, 2/3 of the way down. So he says, "V'kol zeh hu b'chinas meichen hashayachim el hamidus." All this, even the level of the Saba and the Zokin, where natural emotions are not controlling this individual, because everything is in a state of isyashvus, where he puts his mind to it, has a full understanding, full resonance, as he said. Not just a superficial understanding, but a full comprehensive hasaga and hamokus, because he said isyashvus, taitoyasasum, yeah. He says all this is still moichin that connects and relates to midas, to emotions. V'hainu, which would make it b'chinas chitzenis hamoichin. That's called the outer dimension of intelligence. Even the higher level, even the Gadlus, not just the Katnus. The Katnus, where you're just thinking about something to make you aware, so your emotions come alive, your natural emotions are reacting. That for sure is external. But even where the mind is thinking about godliness, and that's awakening and creating an emotion, he still calls that chitzeni sameich. The question is why. He's going to explain now. For who? What does it mean? Moich and ashayich lemidus here. So he says, "V'hu shayizbonus ba'era lekisha b'slapshus be'elamis." Because the contemplation that we learned in the previous page is not about God as he's beyond everything. It's the God that as he's b'slapshus in existence, u'b'gdulas Hashem shemetzad ha'elamis, and the greatness of God that we see through existence. In other words, like he said, all four steps. Even when he says that all of existence is only a reflection, but the contemplation is about existence, and you come to realize that existence is only a malchus reflection of the divine. In the second contemplation, you're talking about the hafla, the wonder and greatness of creation, and that too is only asiyah. That's only trivial compared to God. Number 3 was the Isbaranus and Eris and Kalim, or spheres, or the worlds. So it's all contemplating, you're contemplating existence. Whether it's physical existence or spiritual existence, that's what you're contemplating. And finally, the fourth thing, we talk about the Ribay Ishtalshalus, from the Tzimtzum all the way down, in other words, your focus is on God as he is relating to existence, and you're saying existence is null and void and completely distant from God. But it's all, as he said, it's all a seichel, his bonus, in the divine energy that comes manifests in existence. Ubegdulas Hashem shemitzad elemis, and the greatness of God in context or mitzad, from the context and perspective of the worlds. Like we learned before, the hafla, the very wonder that God can create. Only God can create, nothing else can create. That was the second and third thing he's choosing here. Or the Ribay Ishtalshalus, the second and fourth thing. Yeah, Ribay Ishtalshalus. And then the multitude of the whole cosmic order, from the highest levels and all the levels, which is a tremendous, it's like thinking about all the universes and all the solar systems and everything out there, also in the spiritual worlds. He says, and now all of it is nullified because everything before him is kala, is null, is considered null and void. The hasog of his bonus binyanim elu, the comprehension and the contemplation in these matters, this is chitzeni sameichin. Chitzeni sameichin, because you're dealing with applying your mind to something that is in existence. It's not, as we'll soon see what Pnimi Sameichin is, this is all as God relates to existence. In additionally, well, let me just explain before I say the additional. Now, the reason it's chitzeni sameichin is not because you can't have profound contemplation on the topic. It could be very profound. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a godliness that relates to existence one way or the other. Yes, he's beyond it and existence is nullified, but it's still the handle that you're using is looking at existence, which is ultimately a chetzenis of elikus, and therefore the meichin that is involved in contemplating is also a more external dimension. When we're going to talk about pnimius hameichin, we're going to talk about connecting to the pnimius of elikus, to the very essence of what God himself is beyond existence. And that is going to call pnimius hameichin. I want to just give me a second. I want to bring a sefer in Kuntus Aveda from the Rebbe Rashab. One second, let me just pull it down. In Kuntus Aveda from the Rebbe Rashab, he speaks about this, and I think he adds some words. I want to read it from there, because I think he adds explanation what this means. So let's look at this. I'm looking at right in the beginning of chapter 1. He says like this. 1 minute. Yeah, he adds the following, which is I'm going to read it in a minute. Let me finish the paragraph here in Ayin Beis, and then I'll add what he adds in Kuntus Aveda. The Gami says, and additionally, when Chitzenius HaMeichin is intellect that manifests in the garments of comprehension, of Hasaga, in this you don't radiate, doesn't radiate the very core energy, divine energy. It's like when we talk about the difference between Chachma and Bina. So we said Bina, if you remember, I've explained, Bina is that I understand the idea. The I is very prominent here. I am understanding it. Chachma, it's not about I understand it. The idea is understood. Or Chachma, the idea takes the person, and Bina, the person takes the idea. So the focus is on the comprehension itself, not on the etzem inyan ereliki that's in it. In other words, the more you understand it, yes, the more internalized it becomes. But as we learned in the previous volume, the riyah, the resonating truths of it, can be somewhat concealed. So when you talk Chitzenius HaMeichin, it's true you're not dealing anymore with just natural emotions. What's in it for me? In other words, it's my sustenance, my father, all the natural emotions, or the natural connection that the neshama has to godliness. But you're still, and even in the level of contemplation, it's still about understanding it. In contrast to fully being absorbed by the godliness that you are understanding. So in Elokus itself, yes, you've reached a higher level than just self-interest, even spiritual self-interest, even divine self-interest, but it's still Levushe HaSoga, which is not the Etzem Ha'ereliki. The Klolis Inyan HaMeichin Elu, because the general level of this Meichin, this level of Meichin that we're talking about here, the main focus here is not just to understand in order to understand godliness. It's in order to evoke midas, emotions. And when the midas are aflame, are passionate, are very active and awakened, then the moichin gets concealed because you're not focusing on the godliness, you're focusing on you getting emotional about it and you being attracted to it. And therefore, this stage, even though it's moichin murgash mitzad seichel, in other words, it's coming not only due to the natural emotions, the seichel is the driving force, but it's still a seichel in order to awaken emotions. So the primary thing is emotions, not the seichel itself. Well, and that's why in general, this level, murgash levad. This is murgash alone, not muskel, but murgash, hainu b'chinas midas, which means the level of emotions, rak, shemitzad seichel hamelidan. But these emotions are a result of the intelligence that gives birth to them, as opposed to the lower level, below this, murgash mitzad hamidus, or even mutva, where there the primary driving force is your natural wiring. So seichel is active here, But the seichel is primarily to give birth to the mission. So the Rebbe Rashab, I read three things he says here. One, it's Chetzenes HaMeichim because you're thinking about God still through the lens of existence. Number two, that it's Levushe Hasaga, it's comprehension. So the Etzemer Eliki is not radiating. And number three, the main focus is Le'eres Hamidus. In the words of the Rambam, how do you come to Ava V'yira, the Rambam says? How does one come to love and fear or being in awe of God? She is bainan, that you contemplate on nature. Sumar, you look at existence and you say, wow, look at this existence. It's teaching me how great God is, and therefore I want to be part of him. I want to connect with him. But there's still you having Ava and Yira, an emotion. So it's true, it's directed toward godliness. And the Moichin here, the Hisbaranus, is essentially a medium, means to reach those emotions. That's what he says here about this level. Before we go now to Primis HaMoichin, in simple terms, and this is what he says in Kuntres Avoda. It just helps a little understand this, and then I'll stop if anybody wants to ask anything. In Kuntres Avoda, he uses the language there. He doesn't speak Mudva, Murgash, Muskel. He speaks there Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, which is essentially very similar. Nefesh is behavioral, like Mutfa. Ruach is emotions, and Neshama is Seichel. So he says the following. I'm just going to jump around there. Just to jump to this level. He says, Ha'ava yir shebizgalus halev, shebom is bonus begdulus Hashem. The Ava v'yir that is revealed in the heart. And remember, this can be a natural love, like a love to a father, or to sustenance, a source of sustenance, or it can be a love that's is born from a contemplation on godliness. But here's what he says. I think this will be very helpful. 1 second. Yeah. So Ava v'yirsheb is galsalav shabom is bonus begdulus Hashem. That comes from contemplating on the greatness of God. Sha'oyev es Hashem v'chofetz be'emes ledofka boy b'tshuka murgeshes belev. That he loves God and is really truly desires to attach to him with a yearning, a very palpable yearning, palpable emotional heart feeling. He says this is the level zeh b'chinas ruach. V'hizbonus b'zeh hu b'madreges b'lekush shayich b'masoga. The contemplation here is about the levels of godliness which we're capable of understanding. This is the divine energy and vitality that manifests within existence in a form of islapshus. So we're talking about the divine energy as it relates to existence, not the divine that's completely beyond. These levels, there we have a Saga Gemura. And what's the Aveda Bezeh? The work involved entails to exert himself, with an exertion with his spirit and with his flesh, to understand and contemplate, to understand and comprehend well, not just in a general way, but in a very detailed and profound way. And to bind and connect and concentrate his mind in this to the point that it should be nirgish heitev b'meiche v'libe, that he should feel it well in his mind and his heart. And through this, it awakens and stimulates an emotional connection, a love, that palpable love to connect and attach to godliness. So here he says, even though this work is the level of Meichin, b'bchinas hasaga v'izbanus teva canal, in a good comprehension and contemplation, b'kol mokim hadezeh b'chinas ruach. Still, we call it ruach, world of emotions. Because the primary focus here is the awakening of emotions to love God. The only way to love God is to contemplate. And the contemplation is to awaken the emotions. And even though you're using your mind to the fullest, we're not talking about superficial intellect. We're not talking about surface level. Hasaga gemura, u'ba'amokas hadas, and immersion and concentration with your das. You're connecting with it. B'kol mokim kol ze b'chinas chitzenius hameichin. All this is the outer dimension of meichin, k'moshein b'levushe hasaga, as they are in the garments of comprehension. Shezeh b'chinas hameichin hashayochim el hamidus. This is the level of meichin that relates to emotions. In other words, in different terms, it's meichin, but it's still about connecting to your stimulation, to your emotions, to your relationship. Okay. This is very important. We're going to learn about this more, I believe, also in Ayin Beis. And the bitl is mitzad midas, not mitzad meichin. What does that mean? The hainu bitl hayesh. Lei bitl the meichin shalaman b'chinas bitl hayesh levad. So let me explain that. At the end of the day, remember we learned yesterday from the Rebbe's footnote in Tanya chapter 44 that even the love for a father can also have an element of passion when you think about the grandeur and how special your father is. Not just the natural love for a father, which is more like water, but to have a fiery love requires thinking about your father and knowing his greatness. In this context, God, not just that he's our father and gives us life and protects us and so on, but also the deeper parts of it. But then the Rebbe said that even that requires some sense of relationship. Because if it's completely beyond us, then he says it's not love anymore. It becomes bittul. Because then you are no longer a factor. A father and child, even if the father and child are very distant on levels, but there's still a father, there's a relationship. So as soon as you're talking about midas, that the contemplation of God being beyond us through the eyes of existence, it's still part of the relationship. However, it evokes a passionate fire because you're connected, because you want to connect to something that's beyond you. But it's still a connection that somewhat relates to you. Yes, it relates to you in a way that's beyond you, but it relates to you. Once you go to the bitl of moichin on their own, pnimis hamoichin, as we're going to learn, there the focus is completely on God. Now, obviously, because you're coming from the lower levels, we don't get obliterated and annihilated. That's why you don't jump to the level of moichin. You go through ibur unika moichin, you go through mutva murgash muskel. But when you do get there, then it's all about being absorbed in a higher reality. It's not about you having a relationship. It's not about even your emotions. It's not even about ava and yira, like he calls that. That's still bittul hayesh. That you exist, instead of loving yourself, you're loving God. And you're not just loving God on a natural level because God protects you and sustains you. You're loving God because he's beyond you. And you appreciate that through your contemplation. So that's a bittul mitzad hamidus. He calls it bittul hayesh. I'm just reading the Shkuntus Aveda to see if there's anything more. I think that's enough from here. Then he goes on to speak about neshama, which is pnimis hameichin. We'll go back to that. You know what? After the what I'll do is I will actually, if you want, I can take a picture of these pages. If you want to look at it, let me do that. I'll do it right now. You know what? While I do that, please, if you have any questions, Any questions, guys? No questions? Okay. I posted these 2 pages from Kuntus Savaid. Okay. It's all clear, or it's so confusing you don't even know what to ask?
It's clear to me.
Okay, good. I'm very glad. So it's fascinating if you think about it, because you would think that all the levels we've learned are such high levels. You're talking about someone who's is not focusing or caring about their own needs. They're talking about godliness, even the natural love, that you're not loving yourself, you're loving God who gives you life and God, your Father, and so on. And still, those are just natural. That's how you're the natural. Then you're talking about a deeper love that comes from a contemplation and a serious contemplation, not just awareness that God is your Father, but a serious contemplation. And that too is ultimately you having a relationship, an avavir. It's passionate, it's fiery. We called it actually, as he said, is Gadlus liboy. It's not just the Perek Tezayin, Tanya, where he speaks about just sensing in your mind and your heart that it's worthy and valuable to be connected to God. But here you're talking about actual feeling, and still it's about it's still bitlayesh in the words of Kuntus Aveda. He doesn't use those words here. It's still a love, it's still a connection that is God as it relates to you. And therefore, like he said, the 3 points, it's chitzenius hameichin. It's the outer dimension, and it's not the etzemer eliki, and it's about the midas. So it's really, the focus is midas. Even the murgash mitzad ha-seichel. So now I think we can go back to the parentheses on top of the page, and I think it's much clearer now. Yeah, I understand it now much clearer. Because then he says like this, in chapter 44, I'm looking at the parentheses. He says, Ava ideas bonus kiata vinu. It's called it's not called chilur chimitivim elikashem b'meichim achshavte levad. So then it's called natural love and awe. Even it comes through his bonanus, but it's natural because it's really the natural feeling that you have to God as your Father, and God as your source of sustenance, which is the concept in chapter 16 in Tanya. But when these emotions become revealed, these galus, then it's called Ru'usa Deliba, where he says that seems to be Avis Elam, because now it's not just the contemplation, it's not just the awareness of how God relates your natural emotions. It's a contemplation in the greatness of godliness. He says then it's called Ru'usa Deliba, and according to what's explained here, you have to say the kavana is that the chilur chimotivim, which means the chayecha, hu chayecha, which is the natural emotions, that he calls mutfe. Avav yirib is galus halev. When it's revealed the emotions through contemplation, that's called murgash. Why is it called murgash? Because it's still about emotions. And even further, gam chinas hamurgash hamitzad haseichel. Gam hamurgash hamitzad haseichel is still called midas, are still called tivim, not sichlim. Why? Because it's moichin sheyochem el midas, like we just learned. And number 2, because the midas are still in their natural form. You haven't changed the midas. There's going to be a stage where you can actually change your very wiring. Here, it's true, we're not just revealing the natural emotions, we're revealing more, we're giving birth to deeper emotions and higher emotions, but it's still not against your very nature. It's still kutul dosam. So the difference between Murgash, the only thing that still remains unclear to me is the Chilav Rechimas Sichlim. In Tanya chapter 44, he said that is Bria, and that seems to be the level of what he calls here Murgash. Okay, so you have to say the Chilav Rechimas Sichlim is still Midas, it's Midas Sichlim. And that's why they're still called Tivim. And then there's a level of tchila rechima sichlim that's going to be detached from emotions altogether. That's going to be pnimis hamechin. That's what I believe is the pshat here. And regarding the contemplation itself, from the Rebbe's footnote, it becomes clear that even the contemplation of your natural emotions, meaning God's your father, there can be deeper levels if you think about the grandeur and the wonder of godliness of the Father. But simultaneously, there's another form of giving of fiery passion, as he explains in Tanya, and that's when you contemplate on the greatness of God, not as your Father, but the greatness of God. And that that's a passion, a fiery passion that's revealed, and that goes all the way to Bria. Ava Rabba, just for the record, which is Atzilus, seems to me already moving into the world of Bittul beyond Ava. Even though it's called Ava Rabba, but it seems, because Atzilus is total Bittul. In Bria, you still have a Mitzias, and there's still an existent entity. And I think that's also discussed in Kuntus Aved, if I recall correctly. I'm almost sure he discusses
that.
it.
Doesn't make sense to me. I mean, at all. I
mean,
Avarab is described as a very fiery thing. I mean, all of a sudden
Where
you
does
tell
it
me
say Avarab is very fiery? Hold on.
No, how is it described? Maybe I'm wrong. Okay.
No, it doesn't say. No. Ava of Bria is called very fiery.
Yeah, but how is it described, Avarab?
Avarab is a gift from God. And the Rebbe explains it's coming from Atzil. It's a gift from God that comes from a higher level. It's actually probably a very calm love. It's a yichud. Avarabba most likely is a full unity with the divine that is more than just a, remember, passion has two sides to it. On one hand, passion is very powerful, but passion and burning passion is because there's something going on. There's still two entities. That's why you're passionate about it. Once you become totally one with the thing you love, that it's no longer, it's higher than passion. That's the process.
So that's after you married 50 or 60 years when I talk to.
Well, you tell me, you're at that stage.
Not there yet.
Maybe you should discuss it with your spouse. Well, he doesn't talk about Avarabbi here yet. I'm just pointing it out since we already mentioned it, but I think that's the level, because I'm just looking. Yeah, he says clearly, Ava Varab is higher than Tchila V'Rechima Sichlim. Okay. Any questions? If not, I'm going to continue.
So the Ava Rabba is right before you get the Pneumius Seichel. Is that there's a spot right before that?
I don't know.
Pneumius? Okay.
Maybe it is. Maybe it's Pneumius Hamech. Maybe we'll see. Okay. The next paragraph. Ach b'chinas pnimius hamechin. Now, in contrast, however, the level of pnimius hamechin, this was chitzenius hamechin. Pnimius hamechin, who is bonus ba'atzmus erein sof, is the contemplation on the core of the divine infinite light. Ech she'erein sof kodesh u'muvdal ma'elemus. How the divine infinite light is Kaddish, is holy, sacred, and holy. And Muvdal, Kaddish from the word Muvdal, removed. Ma'elim is from the worlds. Not as we see the divine through the worlds, even though the divine is higher and the worlds are nullified before him. But here we're talking about completely removed. Hein be'elim es ha'tachtenim, both the lower worlds, hainu elim is biyah, which means Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. The Hein Be'ilmis, and he says below that maybe he wants to say Hein Be'ilmis Biyah HaKlolim, because he repeats Biyah. And there's two Hains, so you can't say it means the same thing. So below they're suggesting that maybe he meant to say Biyah HaKlolim means the Biyah in the macrocosm, meaning Adam Kadmon, Akudim Nekudim, and the higher levels. Biyah HaKlolim, we know, is a far bigger picture. It's all the worlds. That's what they're suggesting. He could also say that maybe he means Vehain, it says Be'elamis, so it's hard to say that he really meant to write Vehain Be'elam Atzilus.
But it's still after the Tzimtzum or before, or you can say both.
When everything, Elamis are always after the Tzimtzum. Biyah Klolim, Biyah, Brira Klolis begins with Ach, Adam Katnus, after the Tzimtzum, of course. Ukiyadua, the Inyan Gimel Pamim Kodesh. As it's known in the subject called the 3 times we say Kodesh, 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 it refers to 3 levels of Kodesh, Kodesh from Asiya, from Yitzira, and from Bria. And Chassidus explains it's both Biyah Protim and Biyah Klolim. So Kodesh is God being removed and beyond. You say something is holy, it types Kodesh from the word Havdalah. Holy means removed from a much higher level than, in this case, we're talking Biyah, the microcosm and macrocosm. I'll just repeat generally if you're not familiar with the microcosm, macrocosm concept. So all of Ishtalshelus, the entire cosmic order, is structured in microcosm, macrocosm. Like we say, Adam Cotton Zeh, Adam Cotton Zeh, Olam Cotton Zeh Adam. The world in microcosm is a human being. The human being is like a universe in a micro version. So also the worlds are like a hologram. So when you say the world Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, you could speak in microcosm. That would be, first comes Atzilus, then Bria, Yitzira, Asiya. But macrocosm is you're talking the whole Seder Shtalshus that begins after the Tzimtzum. So then Ak, Adam Kadman is Bria de Klolos. It's called Bria in macrocosm. Akudim and Akudim, or sometimes Atik and Arich, is Yitzira de Klolos in macrocosm. And Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, Asiya in microcosm is Asiya in macrocosm. So it's like, think of it that way. So that's basically what he's saying here, is that when a person, that we're talking about the Eibishter's Kodesh and Muvdal, both from the lower worlds and from the worlds, Be'elamis, Biyah Klolim. You could also say, maybe he meant to say, Ve'hen Be'elamis Ha'elyenim, because it says Elamis Ha'tachtenim, and then it says, Hem Elamis Biyah. So another way of correcting the word is not just Biyah Klolim, maybe he meant to say, because remember, Biyah is in a parenthesis. So if you want to contrast it, it could be the Rebbe Rashab meant to write, Hein be'elamis atachtenim, both in the lower worlds, which is the worlds of Biyah, the Hein be'elamis ha'elyenim, and the higher worlds, which would then mean Biyah klolim. It's possible. I'm just,
it couldn't be the 10 hidden spheres also, which would be 4.
10 hidden spheres, it depends which level they are. There's many places where the 10 hidden spheres, sometimes they're referred to Ak, sometimes Atik. Depends, you're talking about the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum or after the Tzimtzum?
Actually before, that's what I'm trying to...
He doesn't mention the Tzimtzum. Everything here is Elamis. He says worlds. He didn't talk about the Tzimtzum here. Ubebchinas haflaw. And this contemplation is Ba'atzmus Erein Sof, which now is not godly energy within existence, which he said before. The Chetzeni Shameichin, he said, you're contemplating on the divine within existence. And saying that it's wondrous, it's grandeur, it's aflaw, even that's beyond existence. All of existence is only a reflection of it, of that divine. Now we're talking about the divine, and it's not as it relates to existence, it's beyond existence. And the contemplation continues. It's also not just in Atzmus Ein Sof, ubebchinas haflaw, the Rema was the Eir Ein Sof. and the wonder or grandeur and the exaltedness of the infinite light, as he is exalted and in a elevated state on his own. Remember, we talked about the king, Hoig Melech and Hadras Melech. You can have the king, he's greater than Meshich Me'amayim Gavoy Mekol Am. He's greater than all his subjects, even his ministers. But that's how he's greater than them. Then the way the king is on his own, in his own inner sanctum, he's fundamentally of a different reality on his own. Not that he's higher than existence. That's the level of aflo that we're now focusing on. And then Be'efen haflo. You may recall, maybe you don't recall, back in Ayin Beis earlier, in volume 1 for sure, volume 2 I think as well, he spoke about two types of contemplation. In the hafla of Ein Sof, how God is greater and beyond it all, and Eifan hafla, the way he's beyond it all. It's more than just knowing that he's beyond. Eifan hafla, the manner in which he's beyond it all. So it's another aspect of this contemplation that we're talking about now. And now he brings about Tzimtzum actually. In the parentheses he says, and same thing, Basogas in Yonim Nailim, the Eid Ein Sof, when you're contemplating on very high levels of Eid Ein Sof, like, for example, contemplating on the infinite divine light before the Tzimtzum. Before, if you look back on the bottom of last page, Aleph Rish Rav Ches, he said, "Da'asoga be'eze inyan eliki k'may eidos v'kelim u'protei amadreges be'eses sfiras datzilis u'protei elamis el yenim." That you're contemplating on the divine aspects, but these are divine aspects that are takanat as they relate to existence per se, but there's still divine elements in context of existence, like he said there. Here, we're talking about in Yonim Nailim. You're not talking about God, the godly energy that is in context of existence. You're talking about things on their own, like Nifnei Tzimtzum. There is no existence.
Before he's an artist.
There's no even room for existence. So when you're contemplating on these levels, we're talking about all godliness as on his own, not godliness in context of existence. So really there's three levels here if you think about it. Contemplating on God as he relates to existence. There's contemplating on godliness as he's in context of existence, but doesn't relate to existence. And then there's contemplating on God as beyond it all, and not even in context of existence. What God is like in his purest forms. So the first would be God is our Father as our source of sustenance. That really relates completely to us and our natural beings, our biological natural emotions. The next is Mamala Kalaman, as he said, which is the divine that's within existence, but of course it's not existence, it's higher than existence. And then there's Kadosh Shemuvd, like he says here, completely beyond. And the concepts, divine concepts, are not about things after the Tzimtzum, but before the Tzimtzum, Ukahai Gavna. She's talking about in Yonim Nailim, the Eid Ein Sof, the higher, more exalted states of the divine infinite energy. Like you may recall, when we learned before the Tzimtzum, we learned there are three levels. There's God as he is before there's even Ola B'Ritzeineh. He's not even desired, does not have a state where he's not even relating to existence. Then he desires it, but remains above it. And then he begins to envision it, and as he begins to relate to it. Or like it is with the human beings. You want to build a home. It can be embedded in you, that desire, but you're not aware of it. Then you become aware, then you think of the details, and then you go build it. So in all these levels, it depends what level you're talking about. In the interface, context of the interface, how much the divine is relating to us, or how much is it about the divine on his own, so to speak?
Rabbi?
One minute,
can I ask a quick question?
One second. Okay, so that explains Pnimius HaMoichin. That Pnimius HaMoichin is not just that you're using your mind in a deeper way, that the mind is now focused on things that are beyond you and beyond existence entirely. And that is already a whole nother dimension of how a person experiences godliness. And we'll soon see what does it do to your midas. Since now we're not talking about seichel that relates to emotions, we still have to understand what it does to the person. How does it infect us and how does it impact us? So we'll get to that shortly as he explains it. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to clarify, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but at least I'll get the answer. We talk about sort of those three levels of contemplation, the focus of our contemplation that you just mentioned. Does that correspond with Murgash mitzara sechel and chitzonia samochin and pnimia samochin?
Each one is different. Depends what's what. Pnimia samochin is what I just explained.
Right.
This levels of godliness that are completely beyond existence and removed altogether, the hafla and reimamus of God on his own. Murgash, what he said before, he said Murgash is the level of even the meichin, even Murgash misada seichel is godliness as in context of existence. And the mutva, or the beginning of Murgash within the mutva, is contemplation about God being your father and your source of sustenance. In other words, it's revealing essentially the natural emotions that we're wired. Whereas Murgash could also be introducing emotions that are born out of the contemplation. So those are the three levels, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now it continues. Gam pnimius hameichin, gam b'chinas pnimius hameichin. Additionally, this level of pnimius hameichin, and maybe I should just explain because it could be a little confusing here. You may recall, I've said this a number of times, but it's a very vital point in general in Chassidus, especially in Ayin Beis. When we hear the word meichin, we immediately, our knee-jerk translation is mind, intellect. And there's Chassidus hameichin, which would be more like superficial intellect, and pnimius hameichin is deeper intellect. However, in Chassidus, meichin is a lot more than that. Meichin is a creation that God created to manifest himself in some form of structure that our minds can relate to. It's not about intellect. It's about godliness beginning to be something that another can understand. So the real focus of mind is not about understanding, it's about experiencing godliness. However, in Meichin itself, there are levels where it relates more to our understanding, and there are levels where we relate more to the truth and the resonance of the truth of a higher reality. So really, Meichin is the human being capable, being given a gift to be able to touch and relate to, and even understand to some extent, a higher reality. That's really the purpose of Meichin. The world in which we live, we see ourselves as intelligent creatures, and intelligence is our superiority. It makes us superior to every other creature on earth. That's why we can control and dominate and subdue animals and forces that are a lot stronger than we are, because we are more ingenious, we're smarter. But the truth is, the reason we were given Meichin was in order to use a mind to get out of your subjective reality of your emotions in order to connect to something that's greater than yourself. If we were just Bali Midas, if we were just emotional creatures and had no mind, or a mind that was only there like Seichel HaNikna, Das HaNikna of an animal, just to hunt, breed, and survive, we would not be able to dream. We wouldn't aspire. We wouldn't grow. We would follow the program just like every creature on earth follows its program. You don't expect lions and tigers and bears and insects and other species to be connecting to higher levels of godliness. You're expecting them to live the clockwork of the structure that they were created to fulfill. They have their purpose, and they stay in their orbit. The capacity of free will, but in general, the capacity to go off course either in the negative way, God forbid, or of course in the positive way, to transform yourself and rise above your subjectivity, is exclusive power of the mind. So when you think of it that way, the mind is our bridge to realities that are higher than our interests. So when the mind is used well, this is what we said, the three levels, mutva, murgash, muskel, or iber, yunika, meichin. That's the whole key here. The growth of your mind, the child is growing, or the nefesh alikis is also developing from a more behavioral, emotional, natural state to a more guided one, but it's still natural, guided by the mind. Then furthermore, the mind starts becoming a force where you can actually contemplate things that are not just about your own interest, about godliness, but still in context of your existence, meaning God as your father, God as your source of sustenance, and even beyond that, God as the godly energy within existence that's beyond existence. Like all of existence, you discover the wonder of creation. So you're focusing on the wonder. You're focusing on all of existence, but it's still kala. It's nullified only like malchus or reflection. And then you can come to the mind experiencing the divine that's completely beyond us. That extent that even a human being driven by subjective self-interest can reach a place of abstraction with the mind, not just that you appreciate the God that sustains you and the God that creates existence and all the wonder of that, but also appreciating God on God's terms, which of course is, then that is Pnimius HaMeichen. So it's more than just a deeper mind or deeper contemplation. You're actually, Meichen is living up to its real purpose of allowing you to connect, basically to put it in psychological terms, to move from the conscious to the superconscious and beyond, which ultimately leads us to these higher levels of divine experience. And of course, each level has its impact on our emotional beings, which is what we're in the middle of learning. So I just wanted to add that, because when you read Pnimius HaMeichen, it's like you have to really understand what Meichen means. And that, frankly, is the difference between Chachma and Bina. Bina is more the Hasaga, the comprehension. Chachma is more Koyach Ma, the Bittel. Hu levade ve'ein zulose. We learned this at the end of volume 1. That Chachma is Riyah, seeing something, visualizing it, resonating. Those words, hisamtus, more than just understanding, that you're experiencing a reality beyond yourself. And in Chachma itself, there are levels. There's Chachma as it relates to Bina. Remember, Chacham bebina, Hovem bechachma and Chacham bebina. And then there's how Chachma relates to Keser and higher states, superconscious states, higher and higher. So this, of course, is what we're learning now, is all this, how it translates into our Avodah, our work, which of course is going to come back to teach us what Gan Eden is like, and all the levels that we connect, how we connect existence to that which is higher than existence, which is the central theme of Ayin Beis.
Rabbi, that was phenomenal. That was so amazing. Thank you so much. Wow, that really brought it all together.
I agree.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. That synthesis, you should maybe I can write that up. That was amazing.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I will say, for the record, not that I'm minimizing what I said right now, this I hope you recall, I did speak about this in the past. Not, again, I think it was necessary to state here, but this is discussed earlier in Ayin Beis, and it's, I think, important to keep going back to, because it really gives you a whole different take on what Chabad means. Everyone thinks Chabad, that the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov had different students, the Maggid had different students, and the Alter Rebbe focused on, they always say, the intellectual, philosophical way of experiencing Chassidus. It's really not. Chabad really is, essentially, it's about elikus being bridged into our reality through our minds. It's not the mind trying to understand God. It's godliness being experienced in a way that we can somewhat relate to. So we have our minds that we can experience something that is higher than ourselves, a reality that is greater. It's more than just seichel, in other words. It's elikus coming into the structure of existence, allowing the human being to be able to experience higher realities without not being annihilated. Remember, we're not talking now where you're completely subsumed and completely nullified in the Ein Sof. It is coming and channeling into us in ways that we can contain it. And that's also what he said before, the reason that we have to go step by step. You can't just jump to Pnimis HaMoichin, because if you don't go through the lower steps, you can't go to the higher one. That's what he said, if you recall back on page at the 1226, he said, Shekain tzarich li is benefesh alikis. Kishalo yeshalam is vestadim. That you need to have, the way God made it is we need to go from Katnus of mutva to Murgash to muskel. Everybody, even people who are in the highest levels, need to go through these stages. Okay. Well, based on that, okay, because of time, I'm going to stop here right before Gam. He's going to talk more about Pnimis HaMoichin in the next section. And as you see, it's developing. It's quite fascinating. Use your mind a bit, and you'll see that you can start seeing the plot emerging in a way of the whole larger narrative here. But you don't have to force yourself, because we will tie it all together. Right now, we're in the middle of the central themes of how we grow in these stages. And then we're going to talk about how that ultimately comes back to the whole bigger interface. But you see how connected it is all. Yeah. If I recall, at the end of volume 1, he was very explicit there. If you remember the 3 levels of Rotzei, remember 3 levels of yearning? So one, he said, was a yearning in Eris and Kalim, which means that you relate to it directly to you, like Hu Chayecha here. The second was a yearning that connects to something beyond you, but it's still in the context of your existence. And the third was a yearning completely to something beyond. I have to look it up, but it's very, very similar to ideas that we're learning right now. And probably those are the levels. Those 3 levels that I talked about, 3 levels in Shabbos, 3 levels in Rotzei, 3 levels in Bittel. I'll look it up, but I think it's very, when you're reading that, when I'm saying this, it reminds me of those levels. It seems very similar to that.
It reminds me, when explicitly, we talk so much about Chokmah being hanging around Kesser and Atik at that level. So it brings it this almost like a how-to part of that we learned in volume 1 and volume 2.
Absolutely, you got it right. That's correct. Absolutely correct. Like Atik would be the highest level, Chochmah would be the second level, and Bina would be the third level. In the context of Kesser, Chochmah, Bina, which actually is the level of Gan Eden, come to think of it. Yeah, it's correct. But here he's talking about it in Midas. Mutva, Murgash, Muskel, Ibri, Unik, Moichin, Nehi, Chagas, and Chabad. Just be aware of that. So in Moichin, those 3 have a similarity to this, correct? Okay.